thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, before I get to the issue that our witnesses are here for, I want to comment on you and the ranking member's request to the IAEA. And I am deeply, deeply disappointed of their unwillingness to come in any session, public or classified, to have a discussion. This whole agreement rests upon, if you support it, the concept of inspection and verification. By whom? By the IAEA. We are putting an enormous part of the national security of the United States and of our allies in the region in the IAEA, a UN organization for which we pay membership dues. For us not to be able, and maybe their fear is the questions of Part G, in which they can allege and take the position, that's private, we're not going to talk about that. But the entire inspection regime, the entire verification regime depends upon the IAEA. And not to be able to question the IAEA about how they're going to go about it, about their abilities to do so, about the budgetary realities that they may need in order to accomplish what we want them to accomplish. I don't know how one can come to a conclusion on this agreement without understanding from the agency that is involved. The most critical element of this agreement is them. Forget about the sanctions, because sanctions only come into play if they're not performing. We have to know whether they're performing in the first instance and in the implementation. Then we have to know subsequently if they're performing afterwards. So I would hope that we would find a mechanism, and whether that is a letter, I mean, I know that you and the ranking member, and I applaud you for having done that, of every member of this committee, whether that is a resolution of the United States Senate that could be quickly passed, calling upon the IAEA to engage in consultations with the Senate. You cannot advise and consent, in a sense, to something for which you are going in the blind on pure faith, without knowing the wherewithal as to how that agency, essential to this agreement, if one believes in it, is ultimately going to do its job, and for which we are going to depend upon our interest for. It's amazing to me. So I would urge the chair and the ranking member, and I would be happy, I'm sure many other members would agree, to engage with you in any way possible to bring that about. And if it doesn't, then that's a critical material issue for me. So I just wanted to speak to that. Let me thank both of you for not only your testimony, but your service to our country. It's been both exceptional. You know, I look at this whole question of sanctions vis-a-vis incrementalism, and it's a very poignant question. Why? How did Iran get to where we are today? Because through incrementalism, through deceit, deception, delay, through notwithstanding UN Security Council resolutions in the world saying you cannot, you shall not, well, but they did. And each step of the way, we were collectively reticent to do what was necessary to stop them until it got to a certain point that both the world and, to be very honest with you, Congress drove some of the most critical elements despite the opposition of administrations. And so when I think about the context of potential violations and looking at the agreement and thinking about what is substantial or not substantial, I see a history. You know, if you go by the archives building here in Washington, over its portal it says what is past is prologue. And you have a 20-year history here of getting to the point of being a threshold nuclear state by everything that Iran did. So you give it a little bit and give it a little bit because you want to preserve the agreement, and you don't, as some of our witnesses yesterday, including those who support it, give it a quick say, no, 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 this agreement is not for you to play with. We're not going to give you a little bit. We're not going to give you a little bit more. We're going to come down heavy now. But I am concerned, based upon other iterations, of our unwillingness at times to engage in the type of sanctions regime that are necessary. I look at how hard it's been on the Magnitsky list to get people listed. I look at how hard it is, despite congressional legislation signed into law, on Venezuela. I look at how hard it is in Russia and the Ukraine to pursue additional sanctions to try to get them to deter their actions. I look at how difficult it is as it relates to Syria, where we still haven't gotten all the chemical weapons. And so, you know, the concern for me is if you want the deal so bad and you hope that it will work so well that you're willing to overlook elements that may seem small at the time but begin to grow collectively, and then collectively you have a point in time in which you say, oh my God, which is where we're at right now. So I think that those are critical questions. Now, Mr. Zarate, I want to understand something. I'm pretty convinced of it, but I want to make sure that I just haven't self-convinced myself, because I want to be convinced. On page 26 of the agreement, it says, the United States administration, acting consistent with the respective roles of the President and the Congress, will refrain from reintroducing or reimposing the sanctions specified in Annex 2, which is basically the congressionally mandated sanctions, that it has ceased applying under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action without prejudice to dispute resolution. So I tried to get from Secretary Lew a very clear, definitive view. You either have the right to reimpose ISA sanctions that expire next year, or you don't. You can maybe argue about the timing, but you either have the right or you don't. Now, I did not get a clear answer from him. If anything, I suggested that, well, it sounds like you want the sanctions to expire. He did not oppose that view, didn't say, yes, that's what I want, but he didn't say, no, that's absolutely wrong. And when I pursue, why shouldn't we reauthorize those sanctions so that if deterrence is in part by the virtue of consequences, which is that there's an actionable activity, there's an actionable consequence to an activity that you take that is in violation of the agreement, you have to think twice about it, which is a lot of what your discussion was as it relates to. One, shouldn't we have those sanctions in place with all the same provisions in the President's waiver options? And secondly, do you read this agreement to suggest that we cannot do that, or will be in violation of the agreement?
Well, Senator, I think I'm in full agreement with you that it appears that reimposition would put us in violation of the JCPOA, or at a minimum would subject any action by Congress in that regard to reimpose the Iran Sanctions Act as...
Actually, it's not only reimposition. Reimposition could suggest that you're actually imposing the sanctions.
Right.
It says reintroducing.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right, which raises the question as to whether or not the waiver provision is good enough as a safeguard, right? And I think this goes to the larger point that we were discussing earlier about whether or not this framework itself, the way it's structured, actually takes away the ability of the U.S. government to actually dictate how it's going to frame the use of these powers, whether it's in deterrent mode or whether it's in application. The other part of this, Senator, that we've already discussed is the problem that if you begin to impact those same elements of the economy of Iran that are implicated by ISA in some other way, that too could potentially be viewed as a violation of that provision. And so I just think the construct, as laid out, puts too much power in the hands of Iran and those who might object to what it is that we are trying to impact, either in deterrent mode or in effect.
Let me ask two other questions. One is an observation. It seems to me that the burden is shifting here. That under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, it's almost like we've got to prove our case. And that, versus that, look, you're in violation. And of course, we should say why a country's in violation, right? Just shouldn't arbitrarily and capriciously do it. But the burden of proof seems to shift. And doesn't that burden, we all talk about violations, in the short term. Well, what about in the long term when Iran has become a more significant nuclear potentially, industrial size, the dual use potentials of that will be far harder to make the case on than it will under its present circumstances. Is that a fair statement?
I would say you're absolutely right in terms of the framework of the JCPOA. And in my written testimony submitted to the committee, what I suggest is that's one of the fundamental problems of the JCPOA. Put aside the sanctions issue, it's the fact that Iran has suddenly become an equal partner in this framework, and that the U.S., along with other parties, are now on equal footing in terms of how they present evidence and information, and the burden of persuasion and proof, which had all along under the UN Security Council resolutions been on Iran as the suspect actor, has now shifted. And I think that's part of the problem of the process, whether it's with respect to the nuclear delicts or with respect to sanctions. I think we've moved into a different frame of reference diplomatically, which does get harder over time. You're absolutely right.
My final point, Mr. Chair, as my time has expired, is that, one of the things I grapple with is, and it came to me again when Mr. Nephew was responding to one of your questions, is, the hope here that the Iranians enter into a deal that changes the course of their country's conduct. But the whole focus, at least as I see it up to now of their actions, is the Ayatollah trying to think about how do I preserve the regime and the revolution. And it would be a unique thought to think that they are entering into an agreement that would mean the end of the regime and the revolution. Certainly, if they're doing that, it may be, certainly I don't think it's their intent. And hopefully, if this all passes and happens, it will be the consequence. But I don't think they're entering into it with the intent of the thinking that this will end the revolution or the regime. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.